Her name was Sister Eleanor Marlowe, a 68-year-old nun from St. Bridget's Convent, just outside of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She wasn't the kind of woman people worried about. Sharp-witted and sturdy for her age, Eleanor had always been independent. She'd driven across several states alone over the years to attend religious retreats, charity events, or just to visit aging nuns she once trained alongside. She knew how to check the oil in her beat-up bright yellow 1981 Oldsmobile Cutlass and how to talk her way out of trouble if someone tried to give her any. On October 3, 1989, Eleanor left the convent with a small overnight bag, a large thermos of coffee, and a handwritten list of antique shops she wanted to stop at between Baton Rouge and Knoxville, Tennessee. She said she needed a few days to clear her mind, though she didn't elaborate beyond that. The Mother Superior had no reason to deny her the trip. Eleanor was always back when she said she would be, but this time she wasn't. 2 days after she was supposed to return, her absence started to feel wrong. She'd missed morning prayers twice, then Mass. The convent called every hospital in Mississippi and Alabama before finally filing a missing persons report. Detective Paul Hemmings was assigned the case in Jackson, Mississippi. He'd been a cop for 15 years, a detective for 4. At first he assumed this was just a case of an elderly woman getting turned around or running into car trouble somewhere remote. It happened all the time, but something about the reports of Eleanor's last known location didn't sit right with him. A gas station attendant in Grenada swore she'd stopped for fuel around 3:40 p.m. on October 4th. The receipt backed that up, but 20 minutes later, she supposedly stopped again, this time at a roadside diner another 15 miles north. A waitress remembered her because of the habit. She was quiet but polite, had a club sandwich and black coffee, tipped $2, she said. That was the last confirmed sighting. After that, nothing. Paul drove the route himself, trying to put himself in Eleanor's shoes. The highway narrowed and thickened with pine forest the farther north he went. The cell towers were scarce out there in '89. If she'd broken down or veered off the road, it might be days before anyone would find her. He checked with local tow yards and patrol units. Nothing. On October 17th, 2 weeks after she vanished, a small junkyard in rural Georgia called the Jackson County Sheriff's Office about an abandoned vehicle dumped at their site. The car had been brought in by 2 young men who said it had been sitting on the side of an old gravel road for at least a week. They'd found the keys still in the ignition. No plates, no driver. It was Eleanor's Oldsmobile. When Paul got there, the car had already been cleaned out, standard for vehicles left unattended, but something felt off. The inside smelled like mildew and pine sol. The rearview mirror was cracked, and the driver's side floor mat was missing. But what really grabbed Paul's attention was the trunk. When he popped it open, he found Eleanor's travel bag stuffed beneath a dirty moving blanket. Her rosary beads were tangled around the zipper. Her coffee thermos, empty, rolled freely against the back of the trunk. But that wasn't the worst part. Inside the side pocket of the bag was a blood-stained handkerchief and a torn photograph of what looked like a young man with his face slashed out by a knife. Paul had the evidence bagged and sent for lab work, though he already knew what kind of case he had on his hands now. This wasn't a disappearance. This was something worse. The following morning, Paul went to the nearest police outpost to question the 2 men who brought in the car. One was 19, the other just turned 18, locals. The kind who worked odd jobs and knew how to spot scrap metal from a mile away. They claimed they'd found the car near an old mill road, about 6 miles outside of Jefferson. Paul asked if they'd seen anything odd. Blood, a body, anything. Nah, the older one said. It looked abandoned. We figured it was stolen and dumped. That's why we took the plates off. That didn't sit well with Paul. Why remove the plates unless you knew the car was tied to something? He asked to see where they found it. The road was rough, gravel, thick mud patches, and overgrown vines curling into the path like green claws. About 50 yards in, Paul spotted a cluster of broken branches near the tree line. A drag mark in the dirt. Something heavy had been pulled through here. Paul took photos and followed the marks as far as he could, but the trail went cold behind an old collapsed fence line. A local farmer confirmed the area used to house an old barn, long since torn down. "Kids party back there sometimes," he said. "You'd be surprised what kind of trouble you find." Back in Baton Rouge, the convent was in shambles. No one had heard from Eleanor. The Mother Superior begged Paul to keep looking, even as the case started to cool. The media had picked it up though. "Missing Nun Mystery," the headlines read. Flyers with Eleanor's face went up across gas stations and churches in 3 states. Then something strange happened. 3 days after the Junkyard discovery, a woman called the Jackson County Sheriff's line from a payphone. She said she was calling on behalf of a sister, then hung up. The call was traced to a truck stop near Macon, Georgia. Security footage showed a woman in a hoodie and large sunglasses. She looked about 60. She stayed only 10 minutes. She didn't buy gas, just stood at the phone and left. Paul was brought the tape. He couldn't say for sure it was Eleanor, but there was something in the posture, rigid, guarded, that made his gut twist. Why wouldn't she come forward? The call reopened the case officially. FBI got involved, but Paul kept going on his own. One thing stuck with him, that torn photograph. Pulse. When he enlarged it, he noticed something odd in the background. A sign, barely visible, faded but readable. Shh. Miller Auto Salvage. There were 3 auto salvage lots in that part of Georgia. One of them had already reported her car. The other 2 claimed they'd never heard of her. But Miller Auto Salvage, that place had burned down in 1985. Or so the record said. Shh. Paul took a trip out there. What he found was anything but abandoned. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you are watching from today and what time you are currently watching this video. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. Detective Paul Hemmings pulled up to the edge of what used to be Miller Auto Salvage just after sunrise. The road getting there was a mess. Cracked asphalt overrun by weeds and low-hanging branches that slapped against his windshield. Officially, the yard had shut down 4 years earlier after a fire had supposedly destroyed most of the property. But when Paul stepped out of his car, the morning dew still fresh on his shoes, he could clearly see that someone had been using the place. Tire tracks cut deep through the mud, fresh ones. The old salvage sign still hung above the rusted gate, crooked and sun-bleached, barely clinging to the chain-link fencing. A piece of cardboard was duct-taped to it, handwritten in red marker, "No entry, private property." Paul ignored it. He walked slowly, hand resting near his sidearm, eyes scanning the lot. Rows of broken-down vehicles were stacked 2, sometimes 3 high. The farther in he went, the more he felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. This wasn't a junkyard anymore. It looked like a graveyard for secrets. In the back corner of the lot, half hidden beneath a bent sheet of corrugated steel, Paul spotted an old shack. It had a makeshift lock on it, bike chain wrapped around the handles. He leaned in. The faint smell of gasoline and rust filled the air. He took out his flashlight and scanned the inside through a gap in the wooden slats. There were blankets, food wrappers, a nearly empty water jug. Someone had been staying there recently. He didn't want to alert whoever it was just yet, so he backed out and returned to his car. Instead of calling it in, he drove back to town and quietly arranged for a surveillance team to watch the site for 48 hours. His gut was talking to him again. He'd learned not to ignore it. That same night, just past 2 a.m., the surveillance team caught something. A man, maybe late 30s, thin build, wearing a gray hoodie and worn-out jeans, showed up on foot. He slipped through the side of the fence like he'd done it 100 times. No flashlight, just muscle memory. He walked straight to the shack and unlocked the door with a key from his boot. The team held back. Orders were to observe only. But one of them, Agent Lisa Cordell, snapped a few shots with a long lens. The man matched a face Paul had seen before. 2 days later, they identified him as Derek Lyle, a mechanic who once worked at Miller Auto Salvage before the fire. His record was thin: 2 misdemeanors, one for breaking and entering, another for petty theft. But it was his address that made Paul pause. Derek had listed his last known residence as a mobile home in Jackson County, just 2 miles from where Eleanor's car had been dumped. Paul got a warrant and raided the shack the next morning. Derek wasn't there, but they found his toolbox, some personal photos, and a notebook filled with strange lists. Vehicle makes and models, some crossed out, times, names. One page simply read Blue Cutlass. None, don't forget. That was enough to bring him in. When they found Derek, he was passed out drunk behind a bar in Macon. His left arm was badly bruised and his right eye was swelling shut. Paul figured he'd been in a fight, maybe running scared. In the interrogation room, Derek said almost nothing at first. He asked for a lawyer, then changed his mind 5 minutes later. "I didn't touch her," he said. "I didn't do anything. She was already gone when I got to the car." Paul stayed calm. He leaned forward. "Then why did you write about her in your notebook?" Derek rubbed his face like he was trying to wake up from something he didn't want to be part of. Then he talked. He said he'd been picking through abandoned cars for scrap when he found the Oldsmobile off a side road near the river. It was already unlocked. No signs of struggle, but he noticed the rosary hanging from the mirror. He got nervous, thought maybe the car had been ditched after something bad. But when he opened the trunk, he swore he saw movement. "I opened it and she was in there," Derek said. "Alive, barely. She looked straight at me and whispered something I couldn't understand. I panicked. I closed the trunk." Paul's jaw clenched. "And then what?" Derek hesitated. "I didn't want to be involved. I thought if I moved the car somewhere else, someone else would find it. I didn't know what else to do. I took the car, dumped it at my uncle's old yard, figured someone would report it. He left her in the trunk, alive." Paul stood and paced. "You didn't think to call 911, or the sheriff? A nun was barely clinging to life, and you just drove away." Derek's voice broke a little. "I was scared, man. I knew what it looked like. I didn't hurt her. I swear to God." Paul didn't believe him. But they had no body, no sign of Eleanor except that cryptic call and a car dumped like trash. Forensics hadn't found fingerprints on the rosary or the thermos, not even but one detail stood out. There was dirt in the trunk consistent with the soil around the river. Mud with a strange chemical scent. Paul had it analyzed. The lab confirmed it had high traces of toluene, a chemical used in paint thinners and adhesives, not common in natural soil. He went back to the river road and walked the area himself. That's when he saw it. An old storm drain, half hidden by brush. The opening was wide enough to crawl into, though barely. Paul called for backup and went in with a flashlight. The tunnel reeked of mildew and old rot. Graffiti covered the walls. Farther in, he saw something wedged between the concrete and the mud. A shoe, black, worn, exactly like the ones Eleanor was last seen wearing. Paul's heart pounded as he called it in. They didn't find her body that night, but they found traces of fabric, blood, and a few gray hairs stuck in dried mud just beneath the surface. The evidence was enough to confirm she'd been there, but it only deepened the mystery. Who put her there? Why? And if Derek didn't kill her, then who did? By the third week of the investigation, the case of Sister Eleanor Campbell had moved from a missing persons file to a potential homicide. The evidence found near the storm drain, the shoe, the gray hairs, and traces of blood were all being tested, but the state crime lab was running behind, and Detective Paul Hemmings couldn't afford to wait. The media had caught wind of the story. Local newspapers were printing headlines like "Missing Noon Feared Dead," "After Car Dumped in Abandoned Lot," and "Clues Point to Foul Play in Noon's Disappearance." News vans began showing up outside the precinct, and people from Eleanor's church were holding candlelight vigils in front of St. Augustine's Chapel. Paul didn't like being in the spotlight. He liked quiet pressure, controlled. But the noise surrounding the case made it harder to breathe. Back at his desk, he spread out everything they had so far: photos, timelines, Derek's interview notes, maps of the area. One thing bugged him: Derek's claim that he found Eleanor already in the trunk, alive. It didn't make sense, so Paul did something he hadn't done before in the case. He looked harder at Eleanor herself. She'd been a nun for nearly 40 years, well respected, but not someone who kept close ties outside her religious community. She had no immediate family, no social media, and according to the parish records, no enemies. Yet she'd been alone, driving across state lines for a church retreat. No hotel reservations, no receipts after the first gas stop. He pulled the church's phone logs. There, tucked between routine calls from parishioners and supply vendors, was a number that kept showing up in the weeks before she disappeared. A landline in South Alabama. Paul traced it to a small auto body shop, Riley's Repairs. Why would a nun be calling a mechanic 3 states away? He drove out there the next morning. The shop was just a tin building with a few rusted cars in the lot. A middle-aged man with slicked back gray hair stepped out, wiping his hands with a rag. His name was Tom Riley, and he looked surprised when Paul flashed his badge. "Yeah, I remember her," Tom said. "She called about 3 times asking about a man named Jonas. Said he might have worked here back in the 70s. I told her no one by that name ever worked for me." Paul raised an eyebrow. "Jonas who?" Tom scratched his head. Didn't catch the last name, just Jonas. But she sounded desperate, real polite, but you could tell something was weighing on her. I figured maybe she was trying to reconnect with someone before she passed. One of those forgiveness things. Hall nodded but didn't say anything. This was new, very new. He returned to the church and sat down with the oldest nun there, Sister Mary Colleen, who had known Eleanor for over 3 decades. "She ever mention anyone named Jonas to you?" Hall asked. Sister Mary shifted in her chair, fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "Only once, years ago. She said she used to know a boy by that name in her teens, back before she took her vows. Said he was dangerous. That's the word she used. Dangerous how? She never explained, just said she had to walk away from him for good. Like she'd been running from something. That cracked something open in Paul's mind. If Eleanor had gone looking for someone from her past, it could explain why she was off the grid, why she was alone, why she didn't tell anyone where she was really going. He put together a rough profile. The time period she would have known Jonas, probably the late 1950s or early 60s. If Jonas had been involved in anything illegal back then, there might be a record. He had a junior detective start searching arrest records across 3 states. That same afternoon, they got a hit. Jonas M. Finch, arrested in 1962 for assault with a deadly weapon, served 7 years in a state prison in Mississippi. After release, he was picked up 2 more times, once for battery, once for burglary. Last known address, a trailer home north of Covington, Georgia. Paul drove out there without calling ahead. The property was falling apart. The front steps were missing 2 planks. The door hung slightly off its hinges. An old hound barked from the back, chained to a rusted pole. Paul knocked. No answer. He peeked through the side window. Inside, it looked like someone had left in a hurry. Dishes in the sink, drawers pulled open, papers scattered on the floor. He circled to the back and found a shed. The door was slightly ajar. Inside were stacked boxes of junk, old magazines, tools, and in the corner, an oil-stained backpack. He opened it. Inside was a wallet. The ID inside was for Jonas Finch, but the face on the card had clearly aged since the photo. Paul also found a pack of matches from a diner 2 towns over, and more importantly, a receipt for cash paid at a storage unit 3 days before Eleanor disappeared. Storage unit #12, East Ridge Self-Storage. Paul went straight there. With a warrant in hand, he pried open Unit 12. The air was stale, and dust floated through the narrow beam of his flashlight. Boxes lined the walls, but what grabbed his attention immediately was a small suitcase in the middle of the floor. He knelt down and opened it. Inside were old letters tied with a ribbon and a photograph. It was of a young woman standing beside a man in a leather jacket, both smiling in front of a school building. On the back, written in careful cursive, Ellie and Jonas, Spring 1960. Hall sat back on his heels, heart pounding. She had known him, and more than that, this wasn't just some stranger from her past. Jonas had been close, very close. In the bottom of the suitcase was something even stranger, a map, hand-drawn. It showed the winding route of a backroad trail, running near the river, the same river where Eleanor's shoe had been found. Next to it was a word written in pencil, closure. Hall called for a search team immediately. They scoured the area marked on the map the next morning. About 50 yards off the trail, they found a shallow pit, partly covered with rocks and brush. Inside were scraps of clothing, bones, and a half-buried cross necklace. The forensics team worked for hours, but Paul didn't need to wait for DNA this time. The necklace had Eleanor's name engraved on the back. The discovery of the shallow pit with the bones and the necklace shifted the entire case. Paul Hemmings stood just beyond the crime scene tape, arms crossed, watching as forensics carefully lifted out each piece of evidence. No one said it out loud yet, but everyone knew it was Sister Eleanor. The cross necklace was the final sign. Her name was clearly etched on the back, and the chain was worn like it had been around someone's neck for decades. But what rattled Paul more was the word closure scrawled on the map. Jonas had left behind. It didn't feel like guilt or a tribute. It felt like a message, one only meant for her. But Jonas Finch was still missing. A statewide alert was put out. Paul and his team interviewed every contact, friend, and neighbor Jonas had listed over the years. Most had lost track of him. A few mentioned he'd been off lately. One man said he hadn't heard from Jonas in over a month, which placed his disappearance just before Eleanor went missing. A week later, they got a call from a rural county sheriff 2 towns south. A man matching Jonas's description had been found hiding in an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. He was brought in under armed escort. Paul met him in the interview room. Jonas Finch looked worn out. His skin was blotchy and pale, hair greasy and matted. He sat slumped over, not even trying to act innocent. Paul dropped the photo on the table. The one of Eleanor and Jonas from 1960. "I know you remember her," Paul said. Jonas stared at it for a long time before speaking. "She was supposed to forget me." Paul leaned in. "Why did she come looking for you?" Jonas finally looked up. "Because I didn't kill her sister." That hit Paul like a gut punch. "What are you talking about? She never had a sister." "She did. They were young, maybe 16. Lived together in Alabama with their aunt. Her sister Lydia got involved with some guys, troublemakers. I tried to protect her. I got in deep trying to keep them off her back. Then she disappeared. Everyone blamed me, said I ran off with her, but I didn't. I stayed hidden because I knew if I came back I'd go to prison for something I didn't do." Paul wrote everything down, fast. "Eleanor tracked me down after all these years. She found out I was still alive. She told me she never really believed I killed Lydia, but she needed answers. She needed to know why I didn't speak up back then. Paul paused. So what happened? Jonas's voice shook now. I told her everything. About the men, what I saw. But she got mad. Said if I had just told the truth back then, her whole life wouldn't have turned out this way. That she wouldn't have felt like she had to run from everything. Become a nun to bury the guilt. Paul pressed him. Then what did you do? I drove her back to her car. She didn't want to talk anymore. Said she had what she came for. But the next morning I found her car abandoned near the trail. Trunk was open. No sign of her. You expect me to believe she just vanished? Paul snapped. Jonas looked him dead in the eye. I think she came back to find those men. The ones who hurt her sister. And maybe she found one. Paul stared at him, unsure whether he was lying or unraveling. The forensics team later confirmed something shocking. The bones in the shallow pit were not all Eleanor's. They belonged to two people. The second set was decades older, female, around 16, likely buried there in the 60s.
Dental records confirmed the impossible.
The second body was Lydia Campbell. Eleanor hadn't just found Jonas, she had found the burial site of her sister. But how? Paul rechecked the map, the one found in the storage unit. It wasn't Jonas's handwriting, it was Eleanor's. She had drawn it, she had found the site on her own. What came into focus now was a story far more painful and complicated than anyone expected. Eleanor had likely tracked down every old name, every road, every faded memory from her youth, piecing together the truth of what happened to Lydia. Somewhere along the way she discovered where Lydia had been buried, but she also discovered Jonas was still alive and had never been punished. And instead of turning him in, she confronted him. Perhaps she needed closure, or maybe she wanted him to confess before she brought everything to light. But something went wrong. Jonas's car was searched, and beneath the floor mat, they found a blood-stained handkerchief and soil matching the shallow grave. No signs of a struggle in the cabin, no weapon, but one item stood out, a pair of gardening gloves, caked in dirt. Pressed again, Jonas finally broke. She said she forgave me, said she didn't blame me for Lydia anymore. But I saw the way she looked at me, like I was still the same boy who ran away, and I snapped. I didn't plan it, it just happened. I pushed her. She fell and hit her head on a rock. He buried her in the same place as her sister, called it closure. Paul was sick to his stomach. Eleanor had come all this way to heal a wound she'd carried for over 30 years, and instead she was silenced by the same past she tried to make peace with. The press ran with the full story. Once charges were filed, the headlines were brutal. Nun's road trip uncovered sister's murder and led to her own death. The church held a joint service for Eleanor and Lydia, two sisters finally laid to rest beside each other. And Paul Hemmings, after months of chasing ghosts and dead ends, stood quietly at the back of the funeral, hands in his pockets, thinking about the quiet bravery it must have taken for a woman like Eleanor to chase the truth for so long, only to meet it head-on. No superstition, no curse, just choices, buried secrets, and the heartbreaking need for answers. Eleanor's car remained in the impound lot, silent, stripped, useless now, but the story it told was unforgettable, and for the first time in decades, justice had caught up with the past. If you like this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Also another to strengthen our community. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what time you are currently watching this video.